Welcome to the Menlo-Atherton Writing Center's Writing Tips video series. This is a companion video to our video entitled How to Develop and Write a Solid Thesis Statement, where we defined what a thesis statement is and went over the three-step process for developing and creating a good final thesis statement. In this video, we will be going over examples on how to develop and write a solid thesis statement for persuasive and literary analysis essays using the three-step thesis statement creation process we covered in the previous video. Don't worry if you haven't seen that video though. We will do a very quick review of the thesis statement creation process before we go over the examples. Before we begin, let us review the three-step process of how to write a solid thesis statement. In the first step, you come up with a simple working thesis statement. You can do this by using this simple equation. Your subject plus your opinion on the subject equals a working thesis statement. In the second step, you will come up with the main points you will cover in your essay that help support your thesis. In the third and final step, you will add these main points to the working thesis to create a more solid, complex final thesis statement. Now, let's see how this process works with persuasive essays and literary analysis essays. If you are writing a persuasive essay, your thesis explains what position you are taking on a specific issue, such as gun control or immigration. Since a thesis is a sentence with a subject and an opinion, here the subject is the issue, and your position on the issue is the opinion on the subject. Let's say you've been asked to write an essay on the following essay prompt. What should the U.S. do to fight the effects of climate change? We will now use the three-step process to come up with a thesis statement for this persuasive essay on climate change. Beginning with step number 1, after you have brainstormed and researched the topic, you need to figure out the subject and the opinion that will make up your working thesis. Your subject would be climate change, and your opinion would be the United States needs to change its environmental policies. So let's complete step number 1 in the thesis creation process, writing a working thesis. Using the working thesis equation, we put the subject and the opinion together to form the working thesis. The United States needs to change its environmental policies to deal with climate change. We now move on to step number 2, where we need to come up with 3 main points that we will research and analyze about the U.S. response to climate change to add to our thesis to make it more complex. For this topic, let's look at recycling, clean energy, and pollution. Now, moving on to step 3, we need to add these 3 main points to our working thesis and fine-tune the wording to arrive at our solid, final thesis statement. Here is our final thesis statement. In order to counter the effects of climate change, the United States seriously needs to reform its environmental policies on recycling, clean energy, and pollution. In an analytical essay where you are analyzing a piece of literature, your thesis will take a look at one or more literary aspects within the piece of literature and how these aspects help to illustrate a theme or idea. These aspects can include the author's use of literary devices such as diction, imagery, and tone, or other literary aspects such as characterization. For analysis essays, the subject is the piece of literature that you are analyzing and what you are analyzing in it, such as literary devices, a character or character relationships, etc. And your opinion is how these literary devices or characters and their relationships help to illustrate ideas or themes throughout the piece of literature. Let's say we are writing an analytical essay on John Steinbeck's first novel, Tortilla Flat, and how he treats female characters in the novel. Do not worry if you haven't read this short novel. We are just using it as an example. Here's the literary analysis essay prompt we will be using for this example. How are female characters treated in John Steinbeck's novel Tortilla Flat, and how does this reflect the author's view of women? So let's start with step number 1 and create our working thesis. Our subject is women in John Steinbeck's Tortilla Flat, and our opinion is that the treatment of women in the novel reveals Steinbeck's problematic view of women. Let's add them together and form our working thesis. John Steinbeck's treatment of women in his novel Tortilla Flat reveals his problematic view of women. We now move on to step number 2, where we need to come up with 3 main points that we will research and analyze about how the female characters are treated by the male characters in the novel. When one reads Tortilla Flat, it becomes apparent that the male characters constantly and consistently mistreat the female characters by objectifying them, deceiving them, and sometimes using violence against them. So, for our main points, let's look at how the men only use the women for pleasure, con games, and were sometimes violent towards them. Notice that we have kept our main points broad so we can get to specific examples in the body paragraphs of the essay. Now, moving on to step number 3, we need to add these 3 main points to our working thesis and fine-tune the wording to arrive at our solid final thesis. Here is our final thesis statement. In John Steinbeck's first novel, Tortilla Flat, the women of the town are only seen and used as objects by Danny, the protagonist, and his friends for pleasure, con games, and sometimes outright brutality, illustrating John Steinbeck's problematic view of women. Thank you for watching. Please feel free to check out our other videos for more writing tips, or if you need one-on-one help with something you're writing for a class, make an appointment or stop by the Writing Center. We would be glad to help you.